Before we discuss it, I give the word to Sandy.
Thanks.
Please.
I feel that anything I say at this point will be positive. I find that after attending these conferences for all these years, there's always someone who wants to be a scapegoat. And my good friend Richard seems to be aspiring to that this moment. Maybe he'll succeed, maybe he won't. I'm going to take a different perspective. When Bob Doran said to me, would you talk? And he quickly said, Richard's going to speak about Levinas and the Girard War and Peace. I assumed that it was going to be about this book, Tolstoy, War and Peace. And I said, well, my first response would be that I'll call my talk Girard and Levinas, or reverse that, and I'll call it Peace and War. I thought that would be a good performance of the mimetic. I thought it would be a positive performance of the mimetic. I'm now not so sure. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. But I thought it was an interesting way to think about it. And then as I began thinking about Raymond Aron, I noticed he has a book called Peace and War, right? Which is, of course, about Clausewitz, of course. And takes a viewpoint diametrically opposed to the one that Tolstoy takes in the epilogue of his work on Clausewitz, and in particular on a Clausewitzian view of history. So I thought that was another interesting reason for taking that particular view. And then there was a third reason I thought this was a good title, Girard and Levinas, Peace and War. It seemed to me that there was a way in which an argument that I have been making now at least two occasions and cover meetings, has finally been made completely for me by René himself. That Girard and Levinas seem to me make an absolutely compatible pair in extremely positive terms in both cases, and that Girard provides the understanding of the sacrificial dynamics on the one hand, while Levinas offers a way of understanding what Girard would call refuser la violence, as namely, in Levinas' view, it's infinite responsibility for the other individual. Autrui as opposed to autre. Levinas is very careful to make a distinction. He's not talking about l'autre, the other, as that kind of category. He's talking about autrui, the neighbor, the other individual. Sometimes written the other with a capital O as opposed to a small. All right, so in 1995 at Loyola, at a cover conference that Andrew McKenna convened called The Subject of Responsibility, I initiated this argument. I suggested that there's a complete compatibility between the two, that Girard offered a set of dynamics that were missing from Levinas. Levinas is interested clearly in the question of the sacred. In fact, one of his most important texts is subtitled Du Sacré au Saint. Du Sacré au Saint, from the sacred to the holy. So clearly the category of the sacred is of interest to him, but he spends most of his time talking about what constitutes the ethical, what constitutes the holy. Later on, in 2007, in Amsterdam, working with Colloquium, we at a conference entitled Vulnerability and Tolerance, I argued that the notion of substitution was another critical way of understanding the relationship between Girard and Levinas. It seemed to me the notion of substitution operates in an extremely powerful way in Girard in explaining the movement from the crisis of reciprocal twins, of enemy twins, the war of all against all, into the war of all against one. And it really provides the crux of the logic whereby the sacrificial mechanism works. It is the sacrificial mechanism. Substitution is the sacrificial mechanism. It seems to me interesting and important that Levinas identified in the notion of substitution in chapter 4, first in an article, and later in chapter 4 of Autrement qu'être, of otherwise than being, substitution. Precisely the notion of substitution as the foundation for the ethical. So substitution becomes For Levinas, the foundation for the ethical, and substitution becomes, in some sense, the heart of the mechanism for Girard. So there's something going on there. It seemed to me something that needed to be talked about, but we were on the same page. There was an issue that about a logic that could be talked about. And it seemed to me that now that this book, knocked over someone's recorder here, that this book, Ashrei Clausewitz, has been published. The case is closed. The case is completely made. What René is now doing, it seems to me, and I think Bob and Jean-Pierre and others are absolutely right in saying this is the fourth stage of René's work. This is the bringing of the question of the sacrificial in archaic societies and the anti-sacrificial in the burgeoning of the modern world home. That is to say, to what extent does the Bible offer us a reading of where we are? In particular, René calls attention to the apocalyptic text and wonders if one can find in Clausewitz an account that the biblical scripture foresaw, was prescient about. What Levinas, I'm going to show you in a minute, calls prophetic eschatology. I mean, it seems to be absolutely consonant with the prophetic eschatology that Levinas, I'm going to show you in the text that I've reproduced for you at the very opening of this book, Totality and Infinity, which was published when? In 1961, the very year that, of course, René published Mensonge Romantique, which started his career, which allows me to say, I think now, with much more force than before, that René takes us to the point where Levinas begins, and Levinas picks up the point where René leaves off. That they provide an absolutely seamless, diachronic sequence of thought that moves us from a sacrificial analysis to an understanding of one possible, it's not the only possible, but one possible ethical response, one possible way of formulating an ethics, a genuine ethics. When I say genuine ethics, I'm going to come back to this in a minute. What I mean is a thou must that takes no account of a thou can. I know Jean-Pierre has spoken of the unassailability of speaking of a thou must which somehow takes no account of that. That you have to say it the other way around. That you can only be responsible for what you're capable of doing. Levinas would say no. Levinas would say that the only viable and authentic ethics for him is an ethics founded on commandment, which is to say, a thou must that takes no account of a thou can, that therefore precedes politics, but is not itself, for Levinas at least, preceded by metaphysics. And so we can talk further about it, but it seems to me that that's the stake that Levinas at least would raise. Okay. So, how do I show this? What I want to show now is that I want to talk a little bit about the Clausewitz book and what René does with that, how it provides the fourth stage of his work. Then I want to turn to this little chart that I've prepared for you on Levinas to show how everything derives from this analysis of warfare. And I've given you on the back page here, you see the first two pages, the preface to Totality and Infinity. Does anyone not have a copy? There are copies here. If you can maybe pass some of these around. We will look pretty closely at the text, so if you want to, I'm a close textual reader, or a schematic reader here. So, anyway, I'll start. Quite simply, it's been said many times before, I've said it many times before, prior to the Clausewitz book, there are three primary ideas that René Girard talks about: mimetic desire, sacrificial violence, and the extent to which the Jewish and Christian scripture explicate and make available to us the knowledge about the sacrificial, and therefore lead us up to the door, the possibility of the anti-sacrificial. So I'm not going to rehash that because time is of the essence here tonight. But what I want to talk about is how this discussion of warfare constitutes the final stage of Girard's oeuvre. It seems to me that there are several possible ways of talking about warfare, several possible philosophies that one could have. One could say that warfare is arbitrary and accidental. Right? One could say just hostility is just a rise. Right? One could also say, another possibility, that there's some sort of necessary logic. That maybe I've heard it argued that warfare is a market, it creates markets, and it follows some kind of pattern. Maybe it's an historical pattern. Tolstoy thought that the historians who thought that the dominant forces